December 11, 1963, Nairobi, Kenya. The sun is setting on the British Empire in East Africa. Tomorrow, the Union Jack will be lowered for the last time. But tonight, behind the high walls of the governor's residence and the police headquarters, there's a different kind of ceremony. It is not a celebration, it is a cremation. The air is thick, acrid, and gray. It isn't the smoke of a celebratory campfire. It is the smell of burning paper, tons of it. Thousands of colonial officers are frantically feeding crates of documents into massive industrial incinerators. When the incinerators overflow, they drive the papers to the outskirts of the city, dump them into pits, douse them in petrol, and light the match. These aren't just any papers. These are the dirty files, the records of the detention camps, the names of the informers, the orders for coercive interrogation. The British called this Operation Legacy. Its goal was simple: ensure that the incoming Kenyan government and the eyes of history would never know what the empire had truly done in its final decade. Imagine standing by that fire. You see a folder titled Top Secret Interrogation Methods. As the flames lick the edges, you see photographs of men in cages, of villages in ruins. By morning, all that will remain is white ash. Would you believe the official history written by the victors, or would you search for the ghosts that the fire couldn't kill? To understand why the fires were burning in 1963, we have to look at Kenya in the 1940s. It was the crown jewel of the British Empire's African holdings. The White Highlands, the fertile, cool, mountainous center of the country, had been promised to British settlers. They built English-style manors, played polo, and drank gin and tonics while the sun set over the Rift Valley. They called it the Happy Valley. But for the Kikuyu people, the original inhabitants of that land, it was a waking nightmare. They had been pushed into crowded reserves, their land stolen, their movements tracked by the Kipande, a fingerprint identity pass worn around the neck like a dog tag. The tension was a coiled spring. The Kikuyu veterans returning from World War II, having fought for freedom in Burma and Europe, came home to find themselves second-class citizens in their own land. They didn't want reforms. They wanted Ithaka na Wiathi, land and freedom. The air in the Aberdare Mountains in 1952 was different. It didn't smell like the polo fields of Nairobi. It smelled of damp earth, wild cedar, and the metallic tang of a sharpened panga, the machete. You could hear the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the forest, the crickets, the distant call of a colobus monkey, and the hushed whispers of men taking the oath. The Mau Mau oath was a sensory ritual of blood and earth. Imagine a dark hut, lit only by a single tallow candle. You are told to step through an archway made of goat meat and banana leaves. You taste a mixture of soil and blood. You swear that if you betray the movement, may this oath kill you. This wasn't just politics, it was a spiritual binding. The British saw this and were terrified. They didn't see a political movement, they saw a savage cult that had to be exorcised. In October 1952, the British governor declared a state of emergency. The Mau Mau had begun attacking white-owned farms and loyalist Africans. The British response was a masterclass in colonial brutality, cloaked in the language of civilization. They launched Operation Anvil. They swept through Nairobi, arresting every Kikuyu man they could find. Within months, nearly the entire Kikuyu population, over 1 million people, was subjected to a system the British called the pipeline. What was the pipeline? The official reports called it a rehabilitation program, but the survivors called it something else. They called it a concentration camp.
And the orders for what happened inside were the very first things thrown into the fires of 1963. Imagine the Hola detention camp in 1959. The heat is a physical blow, a shimmering wall of dust and flies. The air is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the chemical sting of lime used in the latrines. You hear the sound of the screeners, the interrogators. It is a constant, rhythmic thud-thud of a wooden club against a human rib cage. Then the silence. The British officers, dressed in crisp khaki shorts and knee-high socks, sit in their shaded offices sipping tea, while a few yards away, prisoners are being diluted, a euphemism for being beaten until they renounce their Mau Mau oath. The sensory details of the camps were designed to dehumanize. The coarse texture of the burlap sacks the prisoners were forced to wear. The gritty taste of the maize porridge, often filled with sand. The blinding reflection of the sun off the barbed wire fences. The British were systematic. They used a ladder of progress. If you cooperated, you moved up a rung. If you resisted, you were moved to the special detention blocks, the places where the legacy files originated. The screams from these blocks were so loud that the guards would play loud music or rev truck engines to drown them out. Why did the British believe that a civilized empire needed to use the methods of the Gestapo? And how did they convince themselves that they could just delete the evidence? On March 3, 1959, the civilized mask finally slipped. At the Hola camp, 11 prisoners were beaten to death by guards for refusing to work. The official British statement? They died from drinking contaminated water.
It was a blatant lie. A local coroner found that they had died from multiple fractures and blunt force trauma. The scandal reached London. For the first time, the British public began to ask, what are we doing in Kenya? The Hola massacre was the beginning of the end. The British realized they couldn't hold Kenya by force anymore. They had to leave. But before they left, they had to clean the house. They had to make sure the dirty files never saw the light of day. The orders for Operation Legacy were issued from London. Every colony achieving independence was to undergo a documentary purge. Imagine the colonial office in Nairobi in 1961. The sound is the constant whir of shredding machines, primitive, heavy-duty things that chewed through paper like hungry beasts. The basement is a furnace. The officers work in shifts, their faces blackened by soot, their eyes red from the smoke. They don't just burn the files, they weigh the ash. They have to account for every gram of secret paper. What they can't burn, they pack into weighted crates. In the middle of the night, Royal Navy ships sail out into the deep waters of the Indian Ocean. You can hear the heavy splash as crates filled with the truth of a decade sink into the abyss. This wasn't just a few folders. This was a systematic erasing of a people's trauma. The British were literally stealing the evidence of the crimes committed against the Kikuyu. They wanted the history of Kenya to begin on Independence Day with a clean slate and a firm handshake. As the British were burning the files, they were simultaneously drafting the first versions of what would become the ACP agreements. They realized that they could no longer rule with the gun, so they would rule with the contract. The Lomé Convention and later the Cotonou Agreement were designed to keep the former colonies tied to the European market. Britain wanted the tea, the coffee, and the minerals of Kenya without the burden of governing the people.
The ACP was the modern empire. It traded development aid for market access. It ensured that the wealth still flowed toward London, but now it was called partnership. The ghost of Kenya was being buried under layers of trade jargon and diplomatic smiles. But ghosts have a way of rising, especially when the archives aren't as empty as the British hoped. For 50 years, the survivors of the Mau Mau camps told their stories. They spoke of the torture,
the castrations, and the systematic rape. And for 50 years, the British government said, "We have no record of this. You are exaggerating. The files are gone." The Happy Valley myth persisted. The world remembered the beautiful landscapes and the brave settlers. The Mau Mau were remembered as terrorists. But in 2011, a group of elderly Kenyans, now in their 80s and 90s, some walking with canes, some in wheelchairs, did the unthinkable. They sued the British government in a London court. The British government's defense was the same as it had been in 1963. "We don't have the documents. The records were destroyed during the transition to independence." Then, the impossible happened. A researcher named David Anderson and a lawyer named Martin Day found a lead. They discovered that not all the files had been burned. Some had been flown back to London in secret and hidden in a high-security facility called Hanslope Park. Imagine the silence of Hanslope Park. It is a sterile modern building surrounded by electrified fences and motion sensors. It looks like a spy headquarters, not a library. The air is climate-controlled, smelling of nothing, a cold, artificial vacuum. In a forgotten corner, behind a door that hadn't been opened in decades, they found them. 1,500 crates, over 8,000 files from 37 different colonies, the migrated archives. You can hear the dry crackle of the paper as the first folder is opened. The dust that flies out is 50 years old. And there it was, the dirty files, the evidence of the Hola massacre, the proof that the British cabinet in London knew about the torture and sanctioned it. The ghost was no longer a story, it was a physical document. The discovery of the Hanslope Park files changed everything. The British government could no longer lie, the evidence was too overwhelming. In 2013, the British Foreign Secretary stood in the House of Commons. For the first time in history, the British government expressed sincere regret for the torture committed in Kenya. They agreed to pay £20 million in compensation to over 5,000 survivors. But for many, the money was an insult. How do you put a price on a lost youth? How do you compensate a man for being castrated by a colonial officer? The climax of the story isn't the court victory, it's the faces of the survivors when they finally heard the host admit the truth. It was a moment of profound, heavy vulnerability. The shadow of the empire was finally being forced to look in the mirror. But even after the 2013 apology, the mystery remains. Historians believe that the Hanslope Park files are just the tip of the iceberg. What about the files that were burned in Nairobi? What about the crates that were dumped in the Indian Ocean? Operation Legacy was too successful. We will never know the full extent of what happened in the pipeline. The ghost of Kenya is still wandering the archives, looking for the pages that were turned to ash. The story of Kenya is a warning. It tells us that history is not what happened, it is what survived the fire. The British Empire didn't just leave Kenya, it tried to delete it. But the survivors carried the archives in their bodies, in their scars, their nightmares, and their songs. The secret archives remind us that power is not just the ability to rule, it is the ability to control the narrative. Today, as Kenya navigates its relationship with Europe through the ACP agreements and modern trade, the shadow of the 1950s still looms. The Sugar Pact and the market access are the children of the pipeline. The empire never really died, it just changed its paperwork. The paper genocide in Kenya was a masterclass in colonial cover-ups. But while the British were burning files in Nairobi, the French were fighting a different kind of dirty war in Algeria. A war that would lead to a coup attempt in Paris and a secret agreement that would change the face of the European Union forever. What happens when a colony decides to fight until the very end? How did the ghosts of Algeria lead to the creation of the modern European fortress? That is the story of our next investigation, the blood price of Algiers.